If you grew up in Britain in the 1970s, you remember begging for a Raleigh Chopper, the ape-hanger bars, the long banana seat, the gear stick that made a 9-year-old feel like they were driving something with an engine. At its peak, Raleigh was the largest bicycle manufacturer on Earth, 7,500 workers in Nottingham, exporting to 140 countries. It survived the Great Depression. It survived 2 world wars, turning its lines to munitions and coming back each time. It survived the motor car halving its market almost overnight and outlasted nearly every rival it ever had. And then, after 114 years in Nottingham, Raleigh simply stopped making bicycles at all. How does a company that survived all of that, the largest of its kind in the world, just fall silent? What really happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. The Envelope and the Anchor. The story everyone tells starts with a sketch on the back of an envelope. An airmail envelope, the thin kind, drawn on somewhere over the Atlantic in 1967 by a Raleigh Company man named Alan Oakley, flying home from America with his head full of what he'd seen there. Kids on customized bikes with handlebars that reached for the sky. He sketched the shape of the thing on the flight, so the legend goes, and that shape became the most wanted object in British childhood for the better part of a decade. His widow, Karen, would repeat the envelope story to the BBC as gospel in 2012, the year he died. It's a lovely story. It has the neatness that good legends always have. There's just one problem with it. Another man, a Viennese-born designer called Tom Karen, spent the rest of his life insisting the envelope story was, in his own flat word, a lie. We'll come to that quarrel because it matters more than a footnote. For now, hold both men in your mind. The company loyalist with the envelope and the outsider with the sketchbook, because the bicycle they argued over was the Raleigh Chopper, and the Raleigh Chopper is the reason we're here. It arrived in Britain for 1970. It was too expensive for what it was. It was heavy, slow, uphill, and awkward to ride, and every child in the country wanted one with a hunger that parents still remember decades later, because a chopper wasn't really a bicycle at all. It was a status symbol with pedals. It was the next best thing to a sports car when you were 9 years old, and it very nearly saved the company that built it. Very nearly. Because Raleigh made one mistake, and that mistake had 2 halves. The first was a gear lever, a heavy chrome shifter mounted on the crossbar, right where a child's body would slide forward in a sudden stop. It looked magnificent. It looked like the shift of a muscle car, and it built the chopper a reputation, part fact and part folklore, that would haunt the bike for the rest of its life. The second half of the mistake came later, and it was quieter, and it was fatal. When something lighter and cheaper and cooler crossed the Atlantic at the start of the 1980s, Raleigh, a firm that had survived 2 world wars, a depression, and the near death of British cycling itself, looked at it and decided it was a fad. A passing thing. Nothing that could threaten the bike that saved them. They were wrong, and the getting wrong of it would help pull down a Nottingham institution 114 years old. But that's the end of the story, and endings only mean something if you've stood at the beginning. So let's go back, past the envelope, past the chopper, past all of it, to a small workshop on a street that would give the whole enterprise its name. Chapter 2. The Lawyer and the Lacemen. The world's largest bicycle factory began with 3 men in a room, and none of them was called Raleigh. In 1885, in a modest workshop on Raleigh Street in Nottingham, a man named Richard Morris Woodhead went into business making bicycles with a Frenchman, Paul Eugène Louis Angois, and a third partner, William Ellis. They were tradesmen, not visionaries, men whose backgrounds lay in the Nottingham lace trade, that other great industry of the city, the one built on fine thread and finer margins. They made a safety bicycle, the new design with 2 wheels of equal size and a chain drive, the machine that had just rescued cycling from the neck-breaking absurdity of the penny farthing. They made them well. They did not make them famous. The man who'd make them famous was, at that point, riding one. His name was Frank Bowden, and he was not a Nottingham man at all. Born in Devon, trained as a lawyer, he'd gone out to the East and made a genuine fortune in the merchant world of Hong Kong and San Francisco, the kind of money that lets a man come home and do as he pleases. What Bowden did, on doctor's orders, was take up cycling. He'd been unwell. The bicycle was prescribed the way a spa town might be prescribed, and through 1887 and into 1888, he toured on a machine built by those three men in the little workshop, and somewhere on those rides, the lawyer's mind began to work on a problem that wasn't medical at all. It was commercial. Here was a good product. Here was a growing craze. And here were three tradesmen with no capital and no gift for making the world notice them. In the autumn of 1888, Bowden walked into the workshop, and by December, he'd founded the Raleigh Cycle Company, incorporated as a limited company the following January. He bought out Ellis's share. He kept the name of the street, which is why the largest bicycle manufacturer on earth would carry, forever, the name of a Nottingham backlane, rather than any of the men who built it or the man who bankrolled it. Raleigh's own advertising would later fudge the founding date to 1887, but the truer story is the messier one. A workshop from 1885, a lawyer buying in during 1888, and a heroic single name pasted over a collective act. Notice that habit. Remember it. Because a century later, when two men argued over who really designed the chopper, they'd be arguing inside a company that had always preferred one clean name to the complicated truth. Bowden was the capital, and he was the marketing brain, and under him, the firm did not so much grow as detonate. By 1896, Raleigh was being described as the largest bicycle manufacturer in the world, capitalised at £200,000, spread across 7.5 acres of Nottingham. In 1902, it absorbed the Sturmey Archer gear, the 3-speed hub that let a cyclist change gear inside a sealed metal shell, a small British marvel that would become as much a part of the company's identity as the name on the frame. That detail matters. Keep hold of it too. The day would come when Raleigh's loyalty to that little hub gear would cost it everything. Frank Bowden was knighted. Sir Frank Bowden of the bicycle. He died in 1921, 73 years old, and handed the firm to his son Harold, who ran it for the next 17 years and steered it through waters that drowned lesser companies. The Great Depression came, and Raleigh not only survived it, but bought up Humber's cycle business, and briefly, gamely, built a little 3-wheeled car. Then came a second war, and the works turned to munitions, and the budget bicycle range was patriotically renamed Robin Hood after the city's own outlaw. By the end of the 1940s, Raleigh was turning out 750,000 bicycles a year, most of them shipped overseas, and in 1951 it passed 1 million. By its 1950s peak, the plant sprawled across some 60 acres of Nottingham. It employed over 6,000 people. Across its various brands, it could produce up to 5 million bicycles in a single year. It was, quite simply, the biggest thing in the city, the largest employer, the loudest presence, the place where the fathers of half of Nottingham clocked on. It was so woven into the city that a novelist put it on the page. In Alan Sillitoe's Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, the restless young hero Arthur Seaton works a lathe in a Nottingham factory, and when the film came in 1960, it was Albert Finney standing at that lathe, sullen and magnificent, the whole angry energy of industrial England compressed into a young man turning metal. The factory was Raleigh in all but name, and it was more than the men on the lathes. As Nottingham's Caribbean community grew through the post-war years, Raleigh became one of its great employers, so much so that the oral histories gathered decades later record a striking thing, a time when almost every Caribbean household in the city had someone working behind those gates. The works didn't just make bicycles, it made livelihoods and neighbourhoods and a sense of belonging to something that would last. That was the inheritance, a firm that had beaten the Depression and 2 wars and buried its founder and just kept building. By the 1960s, it must have seemed unkillable, which was exactly the moment the ground began, very quietly, to shift. Chapter 3. The Hot One. The trouble with being the world's largest bicycle maker in the 1950s was that Britain in the 1950s was falling out of love with the bicycle. The reason was sitting in more and more driveways. As car ownership climbed, the bike stopped being how a working family got about and became, increasingly, a thing for children and enthusiasts. Raleigh's sales slid. Through the 1960s, the market that had made the company was roughly halving from its post-war high, and the men in Nottingham knew it. They needed a hit. Not a worthy machine. A hit, the sort of bicycle that made a child pull at a parent's sleeve. They looked, as everyone did in those years, to America. In California, something strange and wonderful was happening. Kids were pulling their bikes apart and rebuilding them to look like the chopped-down motorcycles roaring through the culture. High-rise ape-hanger handlebars that swept up towards the sky, long banana seats you could stretch out on. In 1963, the American firm Schwinn had bottled that craze and sold it back to the children who started it. The bike was the Stingray, and the man who'd championed it inside Schwinn was an executive named Al Fritz, and it was a phenomenon. It sold in the millions. Raleigh's first answer was a bike called the Rodeo. It flopped. Whatever the Rodeo had, it wasn't the thing, and the company knew it hadn't cracked the code. Then came the bike that did. And here we arrive at the quarrel we left in the first chapter, the one that still hasn't been fully settled, and probably never will be. The company's version is the envelope. Alan Oakley had given 40 years of his life to Raleigh and risen to chief designer. In 1967, the story goes, the firm sent him to America to study what its youth were riding, and on the flight home he sketched the chopper's shape on the back of an airmail envelope. The distinctive frame, the long seat, the whole silhouette, inspired by chopped motorcycles, and it said, by Peter Fonda's bike in Easy Rider. When Oakley died in 2012, his widow Karen told the BBC the envelope was real. When his archive was sold at auction in Nottingham in 2018, the sketch was reportedly among the lots, bottom bracket and all. Then there is Tom Karen's version. Karen was one of the most inventive industrial designers Britain ever employed, and he was not, by birth, British at all. Born Thomas Cohn in Vienna, raised in Brno, he ran the design house Ogle for the better part of 4 decades, and the things that came off his drawing board are woven through the memory of a generation. The wedge-shaped Reliant scimitar, the strange little Bond bug, and, of all things, Luke Skywalker's Landspeeder. Karen said flatly that Raleigh came to Ogle in 1968 wanting a bicycle to beat Schwinn, something better than the failed Rodeo. He kept diaries. He kept records of some 20 meetings with Raleigh, Oakley among the men across the table, and he kept sketches he later showed to the press that look, to an unschooled eye, an awful lot like the finished bike. He called the envelope story a lie. Oakley, he allowed, had done the engineering to get the thing built. But the idea, Karen insisted, was his. Who's right? The honest answer is that both men were in the room, and the truth is, probably a shared one that neither the legend nor the counter-legend fully allows. The most defensible reading, and the one the Victoria and Albert Museum settled on when it catalogued the bike as designed by Tom Karen about 1969, is that Karen's studio supplied the styling, the concept, the look, and Oakley did the hard engineering that turned a look into a manufacturable object. The frame, the bottom bracket, the standard 16-inch forks, fitted, as ever, with an eye on cost. What's telling is that the dispute stayed private for nearly 30 years. For 3 decades, Raleigh simply credited Oakley, alone, and no one contradicted it in public. The clean single name again. The company's oldest habit. However it was born, the bike itself was extraordinary, and it very nearly died in the cradle, in the one market it had been built to conquer. Because Raleigh took the chopper to America first. It was shown at US trade shows in January of 1969 and went on sale there that April, and in America it did almost nothing. It was too expensive against the homegrown Stingray, and it was too late. The crest of the wave it had been designed to catch had already broken. The bike engineered to beat the Americans, on American soil, flopped on American soil. So Raleigh brought it home and pointed it at British children instead. It was released for the 1970 model year, part of a confident triple launch. The Moulton was the smooth one, the RSW was the dolly one, and the Chopper, in letters that promised everything a 10-year-old could want, was branded the hot one. It was the right bike, in the wrong country, redirected almost by accident at exactly the audience that had been waiting for it without knowing, and Britain went, quite simply, mad for it. Chapter 4. Every Kid. Beg to understand what the Chopper did to British childhood, you have to understand what it looked like parked against an ordinary bike. An ordinary bike was a means of transport. The Chopper was a machine from another planet that had somehow ended up in the Halfords catalogue. It had those high-rise ape-hanger handlebars that made a child sit up like a chopper-riding outlaw. It had a long, padded seat, the banana seat, the polo seat, with a chromed sissy-bar backrest curving up behind, so you rode it lounging, reclined, king of the street. It had sprung suspension at the back. It had mismatched wheels, deliberately, a small 16-inch at the front, a fat 20-inch at the back, so the whole bike sat low and mean and leaned back, wide tyres with a red line round the wall and a chunky tread at the rear, like something off a dragster. And rising out of the crossbar, gleaming, was the thing every child's eye went to first, a gear shifter. Not a twist grip, not a lever hidden by the handlebars, but a proper frame-mounted shift stick styled like the gear selector of a car or a motorbike, sitting up between the rider's knees. A 3-speed Sturmey Archer hub was standard, with a 5-speed derailleur if you could persuade your parents to stretch. You didn't just pedal a chopper. You changed gear on it, with a flick of the wrist, like a grown-up driving something fast. It was, the advertising said, the next best thing to a sports car. For a child in 1970, that wasn't hyperbole. It was simply true, and it cost accordingly. The chopper launched at 31 guineas, around £32, with some shops recording nearer 35. In today's money, comfortably into the hundreds of pounds. To put that against the shelf beside it, Raleigh's own dearest children's bike until then, the Chico had cost under £20. A plain, sensible children's bicycle ran to around 22. The chopper was not a purchase. It was a family event, a Christmas negotiated for months in advance, a thing that meant something had been given up elsewhere so that a child could have the bike that all the other children wanted and few of them got. That was the genius of it, and, though nobody could see it yet, the beginning of the trap. Raleigh had spent generations selling sensible bicycles to sensible people, with the occasional change of colour to freshen the range. The chopper was a different animal entirely, a fashion object, subject to fashion's laws, and the men who'd built their careers on the slow rhythms of the roadster market were, one of them later admitted, quite unprepared for what it meant to sell a craze rather than a machine. A craze has a life cycle. It burns hot, and then one day it doesn't. But that day was years off, and in the meantime the chopper burned very hot indeed. It sold in numbers that still stagger. Across its run, something on the order of 1.5 million of them were sold, a figure the BBC and Raleigh alike attached to the UK alone. By 1976, the company had shifted 750,000 and marked the milestone with a chopper special edition, the way you'd strike a medal. It reportedly outsold rival bikes 6-1. It has been said, without much exaggeration, that the chopper almost single-handedly rescued a company that had been quietly sliding for a decade. The bike built to beat America had failed in America, and then rebuilt Raleigh at home. Around it grew a whole family. There was the Tomahawk, a smaller sibling for smaller children, from 1972. There was a drop-barred, sporty version that sold poorly. There were the cheaper chippy and budgie derivatives further down the range. But it was always the chopper itself that a child wanted, the full-sized MK1 with the ape-hangers and the shift stick, and the wanting of it was total. Ask anyone who was a British child in the early 1970s. They remember the price because it was a sacrifice their family made, or couldn't. They remember doing wheelies because the chopper's weight sat so far back that the front wheel came up almost by itself. They remember giving mates a baccy on that long seat, 2 children wobbling down a hill on a bike built for one. And a good number of them remember, with a rueful hand to an old scar, exactly what the crossbar gear lever felt like at the moment a sudden stop pitched them forward onto it. They begged for it, they got it or didn't, and they never forgot it. That's what the chopper was at its height. Not a product so much as a shared memory the whole country would one day be able to reach for at once. But a bicycle isn't made in a memory. It's made in a factory. And to see what Raleigh really was at its peak, you have to walk through the gates. Chapter 5. The Works. Imagine standing at the Triumph Road gates on a weekday morning in the early 1970s, watching the shift arrive. They came in their thousands, on foot and on their own bicycles, funneling through the gates of a site so large the workers themselves reached for the same phrase again and again in later years. It was like a small town, not a figure of speech, a working description. The plant had its own fishing pond. It had a ballroom. At lunchtime, men played dominoes in the din. And inside, the making of a chopper was not one process, but dozens, chained together across acres of floor, because Raleigh made almost everything itself. This is the thing that's hardest to picture now, in an age of shipped-in parts. Raleigh was very nearly a closed world. It made its own frames and its own forks. It made its own bottom brackets, its own cranks, its own pedals, its own handlebars. It made, astonishingly, its own spokes. Almost the only thing that came from outside was the saddle, sent up from Brooks of Birmingham. Everything else was born inside those walls, which meant the walls contained the whole strange orchestra of bicycle making at once. You'd smell it before you understood it. The brazing hearths, where frames were joined in gas flame, threw heat and a metallic tang across the floor. In the enamelling shop, the frames were bathed and baked in that deep, particular colour the whole city knew. Raleigh green, so distinctive and so evidently useful at home that it had a habit of leaving the premises in workers' bags. The old joke in Nottingham was that you always knew where a Raleigh man lived, because his garden fence was painted the exact green of the company's bicycles. In the plating shop, the chrome went on, the bright work that made a chopper gleam under a Christmas morning sky. And on the wheel-building lines, hands moved with a speed that looked like magic to anyone who'd tried to lace a single wheel. Spoke through hub, spoke through rim, the whole thing tightened true in a rhythm learned over years. There was danger in it, real danger, the machinery of that era being what it was, and the works carried its share of folklore about what the presses and the lines could do to a careless hand. But there was pride in it too, the deep pride of people who could point at an object in a shop window 3 counties away and say, without boasting, I made the wheels on that. And a great many of the hands doing this work belonged to families that had come to Nottingham from the Caribbean. For that community, Raleigh wasn't just an employer among several. It was, for a stretch of years, very nearly the employer, the place a father got a start, and then a brother, and then a son, until the connection ran through almost every household. When those workers gathered their memories decades later, what came through wasn't only the hardness of the work. It was belonging. A wage packet on a Friday, yes, but also a place in something, a name to give when someone asked what you did. That was the world inside the gates. 6,000 people and more, a self-contained industrial civilization, making the nation's bicycles, at the head of a company that still stood, unchallenged, as the largest bicycle manufacturer on earth. By the end of the decade, the Nottingham Works alone had the capacity to turn out 2 million cycles a year, with something like 7,500 people employed there, and a ring of overseas factories, in Canada, in Oklahoma, in Ireland, in the Netherlands, in Nigeria, that pushed total output towards 4 million bicycles a year, well over half of British production heading for export. And then, at the very summit, there was the racing, because a company this size wanted more than sales. It wanted glory, the kind you can only win in the open on a road, and it got it through a professional cycling team that carried its name across Europe. Managed by the formidable Peter Post, the TI Rally squad became one of the great teams of its era. Jan Ras, Gerry Kneetman, Henny Kuiper, riders who won and won and won. Over its life, the team took more than 900 races. It won the Tour de France team time trial 8 years running, and in 1980 it reached the mountaintop. With the Dutch rider Joop Zoetemelk in its colours, the TI Rally team took 11 stages of the Tour de France, and the overall title itself, Zoetemelk crossing the final line with a total time of 109 hours, 19 minutes and 14 seconds. The whole 3 weeks of France distilled to a number, and the number belonging to Raleigh. That was the peak. The name that began in a Lacetown workshop, on a bicycle at the Tour de France, first across the line in the greatest bicycle race on earth. Stand there a moment, in 1980, at the very top, the works humming, the children still begging for choppers, the company's name in yellow at the front of the tour. Nobody inside those walls, celebrating that summer, could see the cliff, but the seeds of the fall were already in the ground, some of them planted without anyone quite noticing, in the very bike that had saved them. Chapter 6. A gear lever in the wrong place. Here is where we have to be careful, because the chopper's most famous flaw is also its most mythologized, and a eulogy that repeats folklore as fact isn't a eulogy. It's a rumor with a soundtrack. So let's separate what happened from what people say happened, gently, the way you'd sort through a box of old photographs, keeping the real ones and setting the doubtful ones aside. Start with the gear lever, because that's where the memory always goes. The chopper's shift stick sat on top of the crossbar, up between the rider's legs, and that placement was a choice, a styling choice, made because it looked magnificent. It looked like the console of a fast car. That was the whole point of it. A child on a chopper wasn't meant to feel like a child on a bicycle. The whole machine was engineered to make a 9-year-old feel like they were piloting something with an engine, and the gear stick was the centerpiece of that illusion. It's why children loved it. It's also, precisely, why it hurt them. Because a lump of chrome and steel styled to look like a muscle car selector, mounted on the top tube of a bike ridden by children, who stopped suddenly and slid forward off that long banana seat, sat exactly where a young body did not want to arrive at speed. The designer's own trade later described the crash in dark comic terms: a mate's teeth stopped by a handlebar, and your own forward progress halted, glamorously, by a gear lever in a place no boy ever forgets. And here is the careful part. That injury is real in popular memory. Thousands of men will tell you about it, and their winces are not invented, but it is essentially undocumented in any medical or statistical record specific to the chopper. There is no study naming the bike. There is no clinical paper on the gear lever injury. There is no coroner's file, no hospital return, no line in any archive that turns the collective memory of a generation into a documented fact. It lives, entirely and vividly, in the shared testimony of the people who rode it, and shared testimony is a real thing worth honoring, but it isn't the same as evidence. The script can hold that memory as memory. It cannot dress it up as a finding, because it isn't one. And the moment we pretend it is, we've stopped telling the truth about a bicycle and started flattering a myth. What is documented is something adjacent and more interesting. In 1972 and again in 1973, 3 doctors in Newcastle upon Tyne, A.W. Kraft, D.A. Shaw and N.E.F. Cartledge, published work in the British Medical Journal on children's head injuries and concluded that the modern high-rise bicycle might carry a special risk of head injury. Their follow-up, a year on, found that children on high-rise bikes turned up in hospital with head injuries and fractures more often than children on conventional machines, and required admission more often too. But then came the detail that the folklore always leaves out. The doctors noticed that many of these accidents happened on newly acquired or borrowed bikes. In other words, much of the excess danger wasn't the bike at all. It was inexperience. A child on a strange, thrilling, unfamiliar machine, showing off before they'd learned its habits. The papers never named the Raleigh Chopper. And crucially, they never said that high handlebars made steering unsafe. That particular claim, repeated across enthusiast websites for 40 years, is a distortion of what 3 careful doctors actually wrote. The real finding is quieter and sadder and more human than the legend. Give an excited child a fast new toy they don't yet understand, and some of them will get hurt learning it. There was a real handling problem, though, and Raleigh knew it, and it had nothing to do with the gear lever. The early MK1 sat the rider so far back, over the rear wheel, that the front end wanted to lift. This was wonderful if you wanted to do a wheelie. Half the appeal of the thing, the front wheel rising like a rearing horse at the lightest pull. It was a good deal less wonderful if you didn't want to, and it happened anyway, tipping a child backwards off the bike at exactly the wrong moment. This backward tipping tendency was the genuine, physical, demonstrable fault in the chopper's design. It was measurable, it was reproducible, and it was the one Raleigh actually did something about, which tells you, better than any argument, which of the chopper's dangers the company itself believed in. The consumer magazine of the day looked at high-rise bikes in early 1972 and delivered a verdict far milder than legend records. Comfortable and stylish, it found, but hard work, slow, and particularly difficult going uphill. And on the crucial question, the safety question, it concluded that such bikes were safe enough to ride if they were ridden sensibly. Not a condemnation. A shrug with a couple of reservations attached. It has been misremembered as a damning safety report ever since, the way mild things so often are once a story has decided in advance what it wants to believe about them. 2 other pieces of the folklore should be named and set aside honestly, because a careful account earns its trust precisely by admitting what it cannot confirm. There is a much-repeated tale of a question raised in Parliament about the chopper's safety. There is another of an official road safety body testing the improved model and giving it their blessing. Both stories circulate widely among enthusiasts. Neither can be found in any actual record. No entry in the parliamentary account, no surviving document from any safety body. They trace back only to websites quoting other websites. so we should treat them for what they are. Folklore, possibly true, entirely unproven, and not the kind of thing a truthful account states as fact. What can be confirmed, because it survives on the bikes themselves and in the convergent memory of countless owners, is the warning that Raleigh printed on the seat. This bicycle, it said plainly, is not constructed to carry passengers. Every child who ever gave a mate a baccy down a hill was breaking a rule stamped into the very object they were sitting on, and not one of them ever read it. And that is possibly the most honest thing about the whole story. So Raleigh made changes, and the changes tell you exactly which fears the company held to be real. For the MK2 in 1972, they shortened the seat and brought the rider's weight forward, off the rear axle, so the front wheel would stop lifting of its own accord. They reshaped the rear stays with a curve. They welded the handlebars solidly to the stem, because children had discovered they could swivel the ape-hangers back towards themselves for extra style, and in doing so rendered the bike very nearly impossible to steer. They added a small rear rack, they restyled the shifter, and they printed that passenger warning where a parent might, in theory, read it. Every single one of those changes is a company responding to a genuine hazard it had identified, not to a myth and not to a headline. Raleigh was not a reckless firm. It was, if anything, the opposite, and that will matter enormously in a moment, because the same instinct that made them fix the wheelie so carefully is the instinct that will very shortly cost them everything. The safety reputation, then, was part truth and part legend. The real handling flaw, the mild consumer verdict, the unprovable parliamentary tale, and the vivid, undocumented, universally remembered ache of the gear lever all fused together into a single reputation that the bike could never quite shake off. It became part of what the chopper simply was. And when a new chopper finally returned to the market 3 decades later, its makers would quietly do the one thing that told you which memory had won in the end. They took the crossbar gear lever off altogether. But the gear lever, real hazard and tall tale alike, was never what killed the chopper. Something else did that. Something Raleigh saw coming, clearly, across the Atlantic, and decided, with the settled confidence of a company that had survived absolutely everything the century had thrown at it, that it could safely ignore. Chapter 7. They hoped it was a fad. It came, like the chopper's own inspiration, from California. But this time, Raleigh was standing on the wrong side of the wave. BMX was born on dirt, American children racing stripped-down, single-speed bikes across rough waste ground, then launching them off jumps, and where the chopper had been a bike built for lounging and posing, for looking cool while barely moving, BMX was a bike built for doing, for motion, for punishment. It was light enough to throw around. It was tough enough to survive being thrown. And it was cheap, because there was almost nothing to it. No hub gears, no chrome console, no banana seat, just a frame and 2 wheels, and the will to ride it hard. It was about to become the single most desired object in British childhood, and it had a cinema screen to carry it there. When Steven Spielberg's E.T. sent a gang of children soaring across the face of the moon on BMX bikes in the summer of 1982, and a film literally titled BMX Bandits followed in 1983 with a teenage Nicole Kidman among its stars, the craze simply detonated. Every child who had begged for a chopper in 1972 now had a younger brother or sister begging, just as hard, for a BMX. The wheel of childhood desire had turned, exactly as it always does, and landed somewhere new. And Raleigh, the largest bicycle maker on earth, the company that had read the youth market so brilliantly just a decade before that it practically invented British childhood on wheels, misread this one almost completely. Their answer to the gathering storm was a bike called the Grifter, launched in the summer of 1976. And you can see, in the Grifter, a company that knew something was changing and reached for the wrong tool to meet it. The Grifter was heavier than the chopper, tougher, more rugged, 3 gears worked by a twist grip on the handlebar, fat, knobbly tires, a whole bike that looked as though it might actually survive being ridden the way boys really rode, off curbs and through mud and into each other. And for a while it was exactly right. It sold well. It was, for a certain kind of slightly older child in the late 1970s, precisely the bike to have. But the Grifter carried, built into its very bones, the flaw that would doom Raleigh's entire response to what was coming. It had a brazed frame, joined in gas flame, the old Raleigh way, the way the works at Triumph Road had done it for 90 years, with skill and heat and rods of brass. And a brazed frame, however lovingly and expertly made, could never be as light as the welded frames the Americans were now building for their BMX bikes. The grifter resembled a BMX the way a cart horse resembles a racehorse. It was strong. It was willing. It was entirely the wrong animal for the race that was about to start. And this was the structural trap sitting beneath every decision that followed. Nottingham had been built, tooled and staffed across the better part of a century to braze roadster frames. It was superbly, world-beatingly good at it. What it was not set up to do was weld the light frames the new craze demanded. And retooling a plant the size of a small town, retraining a workforce of thousands, tearing up 90 years of accumulated craft to chase a fashion that might yet evaporate, that was not a decision anyone sane made on a hunch. There was a real, physical, defensible reason for caution here. The problem was never that Raleigh's caution was stupid. The problem was that it was so very reasonable, but reasonable caution curdled, over a few crucial years, into something harder to forgive, and the record is unusually candid about how. Raleigh, the cycling historian Tony Hadland records, was very late into BMX. The board was reluctant to bring in the stripped-down, single-speed junior bikes the craze wanted, and the reason was money. There was less profit in each BMX than in a grifter, and, crucially, far less profit for Sturmey Archer. Remember Sturmey Archer, the little 3-speed hub gear, absorbed back in 1902, the sealed British marvel that had become part of the company's very soul. A BMX bike didn't need it. A single-speed BMX cut Sturmey Archer out of the sale completely. No hub gear, no gear division, no profit for the part of the company the board had spent generations protecting. And so, the men in the boardroom, looking at a bicycle that made them less money on every unit sold and starved their own beloved gear division into the bargain, did the deeply human thing. They looked at the future, and they hoped it would go away. They hoped, in Hadland's plain and unsparing phrase, that BMX would prove to be a passing fad. It was not a passing fad, and the missing of it had consequences that spread far beyond the walls at Triumph Road, because Raleigh's single biggest customer was Halfords, and Halfords wanted BMX bikes, badly, and could not get them from Raleigh. So Halfords did the obvious thing. It started importing BMX bikes from America instead, filling its shelves with the machines its own customers were demanding, and it went further still, helping to build some of Britain's very first BMX tracks. The man driving that push inside Halfords, the cycle marketing manager David Duffield, was no stranger to Raleigh at all. He had worked for the company himself years before. He had launched the Moulton in his time. And now here he was, pulling the entire British market bodily towards a product his old firm was too cautious to build. A former Raleigh man teaching a generation of British children to want something Raleigh wouldn't make. The company that had defined for a decade exactly what a British child rode was now watching from the sidelines while somebody else did the defining. Inside Raleigh, when the scale of the miss became undeniable, there would be, in Hadland's careful, quiet words, some high-level sackings over it. Somebody paid for the hesitation. Somebody always does. And now the part of the story that complicates the easy version, because the easy version, the tidy one, where Raleigh simply refused to adapt and died of pure stubbornness, is not quite true, and a eulogy owes the dead a good deal more than a convenient moral. Raleigh did adapt, late, years too late, but not never. And the way it finally adapted is one of the small, human, half-forgotten pieces of this story that deserves to be lifted back out. There was a woman inside the company named Yvonne Ricks. She had joined Raleigh back in 1962 as a secretary, as it happens, to Alan Oakley, the very man of the airmail envelope. And over 20 years she had risen, on ability, from that desk to become a product manager by 1975, in a company and an industry not exactly overflowing with women in senior roles. When it finally became impossible to ignore what was happening on the dirt tracks of Britain, it was Ricks that Raleigh sent to America to understand it properly, to go and see firsthand what the craze actually was and what a real BMX bike had to be. She came back and drove the creation of the Raleigh burner. It launched in early 1982, and it was at last the genuine article, a proper British BMX, built to compete on its own terms rather than to vaguely resemble the thing from a safe distance. And it worked. Not modestly. Spectacularly. The burner rapidly sold over 1 million units, more than half of them within its first 2 years. UK sales rose 57% in 1983 against the 1981 figure. By 1982, Raleigh once again held roughly half of the entire British market, and 1983 became the best sales year of the whole period, almost 1 million bikes sold. The company suddenly, briefly, back on top of the thing it had so nearly missed. So sit with the real shape of this tragedy, because it is stranger and more painful than the simple one. The tragedy of Raleigh and BMX is not that the company couldn't build a great BMX bike. It plainly could. When it finally decided to, it built one of the most successful bicycles in its entire history. The tragedy is that it wouldn't, for years in which the lead was surrendered, the biggest customer was pushed into the arms of American importers, and the culture of a whole generation of children was set permanently by American bikes on British tracks. And then, having lost all of that, Raleigh turned around and proved it could have done the job brilliantly all along. The lost years were the wound, not incapacity, not incompetence, hesitation, the most understandable failing in the world, and here, one of the most expensive. And the Chopper was the quiet casualty of that hesitation. While the boardroom protected Sturmey Archer and hoped BMX away, the Chopper, the bike that had saved the company, the machine every child had begged for, simply aged out of relevance underneath them. The grifter was pulled in 1983. The last genuine choppers came off the Nottingham line in 1982. Alan Oakley, the envelope man, by now risen all the way to the main board, left Raleigh that same year, moving on to government and the design council, his 40-year story with the company closing just as the bike he was credited with faded from the shops. And Sturmey Archer, the little gear division whose profits the board had guarded so fiercely that it had waved the future away to protect them, made 400 workers redundant in 1982. It stopped making its single-speed coaster brake that same year, and 2 years after that, it dropped its famous dyno hub, the little dynamo that generated a bicycle's lights from its own wheel, 46 years after the thing had first been introduced. The caution that had built Raleigh, that had carried it through the Depression, through 2 wars, through the near death of British cycling itself, had finally, quietly, blinded it. The very steadiness that was the company's greatest strength had become, at the one moment it mattered most, the thing that could not see the cliff. Chapter 8. The Import Tide. While the boardroom hesitated over BMX, a much larger tide had been rising for over a decade, and it's worth stopping on the numbers because they tell the entire story of British bicycle making in a single brutal arc. In 1970, the very year the Chopper launched, the year Britain went mad for the hot one, the country imported just 27,000 bicycles, around 4% of the market. In that same year, Britain exported over 1 million bikes, 38 times what it brought in. That was the world Raleigh had been born into and had always known, the only world it had ever known. Britain made bicycles, Britain made the best bicycles, and Britain sold them to everyone else. Now watch that world turn itself completely inside out. By 1975, imports had risen to 9 times their 1970 level. By 1981, imports overtook exports for the first time in the history of the trade, the current reversing, the tide turning back on the land. Through the early and middle 1980s, foreign bikes held around 40% of the British market, and after the mountain bike boom arrived from America and Taiwan later in the decade, that share climbed towards 60%. In little more than 15 years, the country that had exported bicycles to 140 nations became a country that mostly bought the world's bicycles from somewhere else. Raleigh was, by the end, trying to hold a single beach against an entire incoming sea, and doing it while owned by a parent company that many people inside Nottingham felt had never truly understood what it was holding. That parent was Tube Investments, TI, which had taken full control of Raleigh back in 1960. On the day it did, it commanded 3/4 of the entire UK bicycle market. Total, crushing dominance. And over the 27 years that followed, that dominance simply drained away between the fingers. Under a succession of managing directors, Leslie Roberts, then Tom Barnsley, then Ian Phillips, then Raleigh Jarvis, then Bob Ing, a whole ledger of names that came and went, Raleigh's UK market share fell from 75% to 36%, cut in half and then some. Hadland's account of why is quietly devastating without ever once raising its voice. Under TI, he writes, Raleigh had become a relatively small division within a much larger group, unable to make important decisions without referring them upwards to a higher authority. Smothered. A company that had once moved with the speed of a lawyer, buying into a workshop on a hunch, now filled in 5-year plans instead of making choices. TI, in Hadland's telling, seemed more interested in the plans than in the decisions. The firm that had detonated across the world under Sir Frank Bowden, given its head, had been slowly turned into a line item in somebody else's portfolio. And a line item cannot see a cliff, because a line item cannot see anything at all. By the middle of the 1980s, TI had run out of patience with its shrinking division. 3 consecutive years of losses. A Nottingham workforce already cut back to 1,800 people, down from 7,500 in 1979, the fall already well underway before the final act had even properly begun. And on the 1st of April 1987, TI sold Raleigh. The buyer was a Luxembourg-based concern called Derby International, and the price was £18 million, plus the assumption of around £14 million more in debt. Derby was led by a former Dunlop Schlesinger chief named Alan Finden Crofts and an American attorney named Ed Gottesman. And so it was that a 102-year-old institution, the name that had led the Tour de France just 7 summers earlier, was weighed on a balance sheet, measured out in assets and liabilities rather than in the lives that had been built around it, and passed to new owners across a boardroom table. Somebody made that calculation. Somebody agreed the figure. And the ownership of the enterprise on which a good part of Nottingham had been organised for a century changed hands in a transaction, the way these things always do, that recorded everything about the money and nothing at all about the men and women on the floor. Derby's timing, as it turned out, was lucky. Luckier than anything Raleigh's own board had managed in years. It bought the company just as the mountain bike boom broke across Britain, and for a while that new craze filled the sails, and the losses eased. But a boom is not a recovery. A boom is weather, and the deep current underneath it was still running, patiently and relentlessly, the wrong way. The last choppers were already gone by then. The grifter was already gone, and the great works at Triumph Road, which had once held 6,000 people, making very nearly every single part of a bicycle beneath one roof, from the spokes up, was growing quieter, year on year, in a way that no lucky boom and no new owner had the power to reverse. The decline had a rhythm to it now, and every beat of that rhythm was downward. Chapter 9. The last wheel, the 1990s were the long goodbye, and it's important to say that the men who presided over it were not villains. They were managers, doing what managers do, reading the numbers and making the decisions the numbers seemed to demand, in a country that had, by then, largely stopped making its own bicycles at all. The hardest of those decisions came right at the end of the decade, under a chief executive named Gary Matthews. In late 1999, Derby sold the historic Triumph Road site, the ground the company had occupied for generation upon generation, the very floor the works stood on, to the University of Nottingham, and it sold that ground without having first secured a replacement factory to move the making into. One account called the decision, flatly and without elaboration, disastrous, and it is genuinely difficult to argue the point. You do not sell the floor you are standing on before you have found another floor to stand on. It is the kind of thing that reads, in hindsight, like the beginning of an ending, because it was. Matthews also sold Sturmey Archer, the gear division that had been part of Raleigh's soul since 1902. The little sealed hub the board had once protected so fiercely, so short-sightedly, that it had waved away the entire BMX revolution rather than starve it of profit. Now it was simply sold off, for a nominal sum, to an investment firm, and soon afterwards it was closed altogether, drawing criticism from cyclists around the world who understood exactly what was being thrown into the skip. There is a bitter symmetry in it that needs no underlining. The thing the board sacrificed the future to protect in 1982 was itself discarded, casually, for almost nothing, before the century was out, and the machines went too. In May 1999, Raleigh announced that it would cease volume frame production in Britain entirely. The frame welding robots, installed as recently as 1996, the very machines that represented Nottingham's belated answer to the welded frame future, the capability the company had lacked so fatally when BMX first arrived, were auctioned off that December, sold for whatever the room would bid. Think about the shape of that. Raleigh finally acquired the ability to weld light frames at scale, the thing it had needed a decade and a half earlier, and then within 3 years auctioned the equipment off to the highest bidder, the answer arriving just in time to be sold as scrap. A management buyout, led once again by Findon Crofts, took over what little remained in 2001 and renamed the business Raleigh Cycle Limited, reaching back for the old, proud name. But the actual physical making of bicycles in Nottingham, the thing the whole story had always been about, was very nearly finished. It ended on a Thursday, the 28th of November, 2002. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, the last wheel came off the line at Triumph Road. There were 280 people left to see it happen. 280, from 7,500, 23 years before, to 280 souls in a building built for thousands. And when the line finally stopped, they did the thing that Nottingham working people had always done to mark a moment that mattered. The only fitting thing, really. They went to the pub, a crawl around Radford, the neighbourhood that had lived its whole life in the shadow of the works, the last of the Raleigh people walking out through the gates and drinking, together, to the end of Raleigh. Behind them, the vast building fell silent. A journalist who witnessed the emptied works reached for a phrase that stays with you afterwards, lodges somewhere and won't leave. That Marie Celeste feeling. A place built for the noise and movement of thousands, suddenly holding no one. Everything still in its place. Everyone simply gone. The workers, some of them, complained afterwards that the management hadn't made very much of the company's historic last day, that 114 years had been allowed to end on a quiet Thursday afternoon, with a single wheel and a pub crawl, and not much ceremony to mark it. And there is something almost unbearably true to the whole story in that final small neglect. The clean single name to the last, the collective act underneath it, barely acknowledged. The local Member of Parliament, Graham Allen, blamed the final round of job losses partly on a local campaign that had opposed keeping a working factory on the allotment ground nearby. But the deeper truth was always longer and sadder than any single cause anyone could point to. Decades of slow decline, cheaper competition arriving from Southeast Asia, a market that had turned itself completely inside out in the span of one working lifetime, and 100 small hesitations, each one of which had seemed, at the precise moment it was made, entirely reasonable. Nobody set out to kill Raleigh. Nobody ever does, with these things. That's the nature of this kind of death. It doesn't arrive in a single catastrophic blow that you can name and blame. It comes instead through 1,000 sensible days, each one nudging the work a little further from the hands that knew how to do it, until one ordinary Thursday afternoon there is simply nothing left to nudge. And what was lost that afternoon was never only the jobs, though it was the jobs, thousands of them, gone across 2 decades of contraction. It was a whole ecosystem of human skill that had taken a full century to grow and could not, once gone, ever be regrown. The brazers who joined frames in gas flame, the enamelers who mixed and applied that famous pilfered green, the wheel builders whose hands moved faster than a watching eye could follow, spoke through hub, spoke through rim. The platers, the men and women who could, between them, make every single part of a bicycle out of raw metal, under one roof, the way almost no one anywhere makes anything anymore. It was a community institution, central to the identity of an entire city, and central especially to the Caribbean families of Nottingham, for so many of whom Raleigh had been the very place where the city first said, plainly and without conditions, yes, there is work here for you, and belonging, and a future for your sons. All of it. Gone quiet at 3 o'clock on a Thursday. Chapter 10. Only memories remain. Walk the ground now and you would never know a single part of it. Where the works once stood, the University of Nottingham built its Jubilee campus, a genuine showpiece of environmental architecture. Low, elegant buildings gathered around a long serpentine lake, opened by the Queen in 1999 and grown since to some 65 acres. And it is beautiful, truly, and there is no cruelty anywhere in it, and that is somehow almost the hardest part of the whole thing. Nothing of the Raleigh factory remains. Not a wall, not a hearth, not a single fleck of that green. Students walk to their lectures across ground, where 6,000 people once made the nation's bicycles, and they have no earthly reason to feel the absence, because absence leaves no mark on a lawn. The grass does not remember the blazing hearths. The lake does not know what stood where it now lies. And there is a detail here almost too neat, too pointed to be quite believable. Except that it's true. The university that rose so gracefully on the ruins of the world's greatest bicycle factory runs its own campus in Ningbo, in China. And the bicycles that Britain rides now are, in the main, made in China and imported. The trade that once flowed outward from Nottingham to 140 countries reversed entirely, running now the other way, in through the ports. On the very ground where Raleigh exported to the world, the bikes come in from abroad. Raleigh itself survives, after a fashion, as a name. The headquarters moved out to Eastwood in Nottinghamshire, the brand now owned by the Dutch Axel Group. But the making is elsewhere now, as the making of so very much in Britain is elsewhere now. And the chopper? The chopper became, in the end, exactly what it had always secretly been from the very beginning. Not transport, treasure. Original examples now change hands for serious money, several £1,000s for a good, honest one. In 2014, a Mk2 that had once been given as a gift to President Ronald Reagan sold at auction for $35,000 American dollars. The band Supergrass put choppers front and center in a music video, and a whole generation felt an unexpected tug at something in the chest. And when Raleigh relaunched the bike in 2004 as the Mk3, remade in lightweight aluminium alloy, the purists were unhappy, but the change they hated the very most was the telling one: the gear lever. That magnificent, notorious, testicle-endangering lump of chrome on the crossbar was gone, replaced by discrete gears on the handlebar with a small commemorative sticker placed, almost apologetically, where the old shifter used to sit. The company's own man later made it clear that this had been a straightforward commercial decision, not one forced by any safety law at all. But the meaning of it was plain enough for anyone to read. The single most memorable thing about the entire bicycle was the one thing they finally found they couldn't keep. Then in 2023, they brought back the shape that people had actually loved all along. A new chopper, modelled faithfully on the beloved Mk2, offered in the original infrared and ultraviolet at £950. The stock, it's reported, sold out within hours. A bike that had cost £32 and broken family budgets across the country in 1970 now cost the better part of £1,000. And Britain bought the entire run in a single afternoon. Because Britain was never really buying a bicycle. It was buying back a Christmas morning in 1972, when the thing waiting beside the tree was the most wanted object in the entire world. Think, for a moment, about everything this company survived before it fell. Raleigh survived the collapse of the Victorian cycling fads that killed 100 of its rivals, stone dead. It survived the Great Depression and bought up its beaten competitors while it did so, and built a little three-wheeled car for good measure, almost out of high spirits. It survived 2 world wars, turning its lines over to munitions and coming back, each time, to bicycles. It survived the near death of British cycling itself through the 1950s and 60s, when the motorcar halved its market almost overnight and left it fighting for its life. It survived the small wheel wars against Moulton. It outlasted very nearly every single firm it had ever raced against, in the shops or on the road. It survived all of that, every bit of it. And then it was undone, at the last, not by any catastrophe you could name, not by war, not by depression, not by a single fatal blow from outside, but by a bicycle for children. By the very caution and the very craft that had carried it safely through absolutely everything else, trusted just a little too long, held on to just one crucial moment, past the point at which the whole world quietly changed its shape. That is the tragedy of the chopper, and it is a quiet one, and quiet tragedies are often the ones that ache the longest. The bike that saved Raleigh taught Raleigh, in the saving, to trust its own instincts, and those instincts, so wonderfully reliable for so long, through so much, were exactly the thing that stopped the company seeing the light. Welded, American future, coming until that future had already walked in through the gates and made itself at home. The defining machine of a British childhood went obsolete very nearly overnight, and it helped pull down with it, in the end, an institution that had stood in one city for 114 years. The children who once begged for choppers are in their 50s and 60s now. They remember the price of the thing, because the price was a sacrifice their family either made or couldn't. They remember the wheelies and the backies, and more than a few of them remember the exact feeling of the gear lever at the worst possible moment. And some of them, when they catch sight of one now, behind glass at an auction house or gleaming impossibly in a reissue shop window, feel something they can't quite put a name to. A pull backwards, towards a Nottingham that made things, towards a Green that used to leave the factory in workers' bags and turn up, unmistakably, on garden fences 3 streets away. Towards a works at Triumph Road that hummed with the noise and heat and pride of 6,000 people and is now a quiet, beautiful lake with students walking past it who will never know. Nothing of the factory remains, but the bike remains, in memory and in metal, the coolest thing a British child ever wanted. And that, in the end, is what a eulogy is truly for. Not to lay blame, not to settle scores, just to say clearly, out loud, before the very last of it fades from living memory. This was here. It mattered. And we were fortunate, all of us, to have had it at all.